base that has been established, and President Trump actually visited the base last May, as a matter of fact. So we had the order. There were some rumblings that there was, among the Qataris, of a shelter in place. That happened a couple of hours ago. There was a suggestion that Iran might take aim at one or more U.S. bases. This isn't a small base. This isn't al-Assad, which we're hearing could be in the target lines as well, and that's in Iraq, about 2,500 people. This is a huge base, and it's also very well defended. So whether this is a sort of symbolic attack, we don't know the number of missiles that were sent over there. Again, we're trying to verify with CENTCOM, Central Command themselves, and verify that video that we've been watching. But this is not only one of the biggest bases, but it's also one of the best defended. So it might be symbolic that the Iranians are saying, look, we're going to hit you right where you live, right at your Central Command headquarters in the Middle East. But also, it's more likely that this base and the anti-missile defenses from the Qataris and the United States would be able to intercept those missiles coming in. So really light on detail right now as far as the gravity of this and how many missiles have been fired or intercepted. But yes, we can confirm that something is underway at the Al Udeid base. Defenses are up, troops are sheltering in place, and we don't know if this is just the first of many or whether it's the last. Okay, Charlie Daggett at the Pentagon, thank you. Let's bring in Holly Williams, who's in Iraq in the city of Erbil. Holly, what are you hearing? What's the temperature where you are?
I made a wish for a moment with you.
Why the Qatar? Based in Qatar.
And in Qatar. Now, you heard just then from Charlie about the situation at the Al Udeid base in Qatar. The Reuters news agency is reporting that U.S. forces at the Al-Assad base here in Iraq have been placed on maximum alert and ordered to shelter in bunkers. We'll update you with any more information we get on that. Now, of course, this is not unexpected. Iran's foreign minister said following the U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear sites that his country had to respond. We spoke to one Middle Eastern security expert who said that essentially the Iranian regime did have to respond because otherwise it risked looking weak and being humiliated in front of its own people. Before this happened, U.S. forces here in the Middle East, and there were around 40,000 U.S. troops here in the Middle East, along with bases scattered across the region, they had been placed on high alert because of a possible Iranian retaliation.
Holly Williams, thank you very much for that update. We'll be back to you in a moment. Joining us now is CBS News national security contributor Samantha Vinograd. Sam, what do you make of this? These reports here in this retaliation for the attacks over the weekend that we knew was coming? What do you make of what we know so far?
John, scary moment for sure, but this is exactly what security officials have been preparing for some time. As Charlie noted, this is the home of U.S. Central Command. There are a range of critical assets at this base, drones, aircraft, and more, used for all kinds of operations, including counterterrorism operations. The Emiri Air Force is also at this base, and all members of the U.S. military have been further adding assets in and around Al Udeid and other large military installations in the region to prevent retaliatory attacks. So as Charlie noted, this may be symbolic in nature. They attacked at a very well-defended base. Iran has a long history of attacking U.S. military facilities in the region, so to a certain extent, we expected this moment. The unknown question at this time is whether this is it, or if Iran is planning to escalate further and switch from attacking a well-defended base to potentially civilian targets. And that's why the U.S. government is warning civilians to shelter in place to the extent possible. I will note, I do have sources indicating that this intelligence was received relatively recently, and that they are combing through intelligence sources to identify again whether this was a one-off or there's more to come.
Sam Vinograd, thank you so much. The pictures we're showing you are
near where this base is in Qatar. We're not showing you live pictures of the base, but it's near it. So those are the pictures you're seeing. I'm not going to make a guess at what we're actually seeing for the moment, but let's go where we have fresh reporting from Weijia Zhang, who is at the White House. Weijia, I understand the president was about to, or is in, a national security meeting when this news broke.
And John, to be clear, that meeting was already on the books for inside the Oval Office with members of his national security team. What we are working to find out right now is whether they have all moved into the Situation Room as they monitor what is unfolding before us. And as Sam just pointed out, this is not necessarily a shock because sources here said they were anticipating some kind of response. And we know that in January of 2020, when the U.S. took out Iranian military General Qasem Soleimani, this is exactly how the Iranians responded, attacking U.S. air bases in the region that led to dozens of members of the military suffering from traumatic brain injury. So this is something that was always possibly anticipated, but the president and all of his top advisors were signaling that Iran had a choice. They were urging Tehran to come back to the negotiating table and hash out a deal to abandon their nuclear program. But John, just this morning, the Iranian mission to the United Nations posted on social media that the U.S. destroyed diplomacy. They added that the so-called offer, quote, was nothing more than a deceitful ploy. So now the question is how the U.S. will respond, because the president has already said if Iran chose not to take the path of diplomacy and chose something else, he said there would be severe consequences. John.
Weijia Zhang at the White House. Thank you, Weijia. Joining us now is retired Air Force Lieutenant General Mark Wetherington. General, thank you for being with us. Your immediate reaction to what you've heard.
Well, thanks, Sean. Glad to be here. And I'm not surprised by this. I think we all expected some form of retaliation was coming. A little bit of surprise that they pick one of those locations, because it obviously widens the conflict with one of their neighbors. And Iran and Qatar share the largest natural gas field in the world, and so it's a significant relationship that they have there. But Al Udeid is one of the most important force protection platforms we have in the theater. It's the largest tanker base in the region. It's a significant hub for military activity, and so we shouldn't be surprised. I know General Kurilla at CENTCOM has been thinking through these force protection decisions.
Given that we shouldn't be surprised, and this is basically, as I gather, the biggest target that Iran could hit, one of the questions is it symbolic in that I'm coming right to your front door, or is it symbolic in that we must respond to something, and therefore we're going to fire missiles somewhere where the U.S. has a really good chance of defending against them?
Well, I'm not sure I can get inside what Iran might be thinking, but I think certainly they wanted to respond, and this is one of the initial steps that they could take, right? They still have some short-range capability. Israel has done a lot to attrit their medium-range capabilities. They can strike Tel Aviv, and so a shorter-range target is probably significant. I still think the most important target to the Iranians is likely a U.S. warship in the region, because that's sovereign U.S. territory on the sea, and presents a very important target to them that wouldn't also be a challenge because of their neighbors in the region.
Margaret Brennan is reporting 6 missiles have been fired at the base. What kinds of defenses would they have at the base for these kinds of short-range missiles, which we understand they are?
Yeah, John, we've traditionally had some short-range air defense and medium-range air defense capabilities. You think Patriot. Regionally, there's going to be an air defense laydown that's going to support all the critical assets, defended assets in the region, and that's something that U.S. Central Command will look at. And I'm sure Al Udeid is prioritized very high on that list.
Okay, excellent, General. We'll be back to you in a moment. Margaret Brennan, moderator of Face the Nation, is joining us with some new reporting. Margaret.
Hi, John. Well, I've been talking to diplomats in the region who are telling me that this was expected. This appears so far to have been a calibrated response by Iran using short-range missiles. And the choice of target very clearly to send that message from Iran back that they felt compelled they had to send. So the United States, as we know, had warned Americans in the region early this morning in particular countries to shelter in place. that was the first sign we knew something may be coming. And what I'm told by diplomats in the region is behind the scenes, the United States was closely coordinating with the government in Qatar and in other areas, by the way. I've been in touch with other Gulf nation officials as well who are bracing. They have been bracing for days, to be frank, concerned that association with the United States would make them targets. Now, these U.S. bases that are on the territory of countries like Bahrain and Kuwait and Qatar are well fortified, but there is that risk, of course, that a missile could land outside that range. Now, CENTCOM is monitoring the air. We know that would be expected since these countries are within that region of responsibility, but this is exactly what many of these Arab states had wondered. I asked the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, just yesterday, what is the U.S. policy if an ally is hit, and would the United States defend them? And his response was indirect, but that this is why these U.S. bases are there, because of the threat from Iran. So everyone is waiting to see what more could come. These are well-fortified institutions. Those other concerns we've been talking about at CBS for days, sleeper cells, low-level terror attacks, those things are harder to gauge against. And we do know that on the homeland front here in America, officials have been talking about planning for that as well.
Margaret, you used the word calibrated. The president during the campaign, made some references to that retaliatory act that Iran took in response to the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And he suggested in his remarks that the Iranian response was kind of calibrated. In other words, almost with a theatrical quality. Something had to be done to satisfy domestic pressure, but that it was not on a scale of 1 to 10, say a 10 response. Is that the way in which you mean calibrated in terms of this early action that we're learning about just now?
Precisely. In that 2020 attack, we know from the then head of CENTCOM, General McKenzie, who's written about it, talked about it on our air because he was procuring the theater at the time. They saw the Iranian missiles get ready to launch. They saw where they were targeting. They knew when it was coming. So that doesn't mean it's without risk. There were troops on that airbase that was hit by Iran back in 2020 who suffered traumatic brain injuries, but there was no death. And so they're mitigating risk, the United States behind the scenes, whether it's military officials, and I'm sure our Pentagon folks are tracking closely, or if it's diplomats. And we also know on the Homeland Security front that Homeland Security officials in the United States are also trying to plan for what if. But there's a lot right now that will depend on what President Trump decides to do. Does he let this go? Do his military advisors say to him, this is calibrated, it could have been worse? Or does he choose to slap back again? That's a question on that escalation ladder that analysts are going to be watching closely. But for our close allies in the region, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, they are very concerned that something may be coming to them and that the strike at Qatar that we're seeing may not be the end of it. The place that U.S. officials have been most concerned about vulnerability for America is in Iraq. And those forces, that small force we still have in Syria. And I know Iraqi officials have been on alert. There was an ordered departure of Americans from our bases and diplomatic posts a few weeks back. So there has been some expectation that this is the kind of thing that could be happening.
Margaret Brennan, thank you. Margaret was saying that the U.S. has been preparing and ready for this, and Qatar reporting comes in, reporting, I believe, attributed to the authorities in Qatar are saying that they have successfully intercepted missiles targeting a U.S. base. So the U.S. saw it coming and appears to have intercepted those missiles. Let's turn to Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, the president was just at this base in Qatar about a month ago.
That's right, John. I was there covering him, and it's no surprise that he chose this particular base to visit, Al Udeid. It is the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East, home to 10,000 U.S. troops. They share that massive base with British troops and Qatari troops as well. It's about an hour or so outside Doha. It goes on for miles, and it has been a crucial outpost for the United States, both when it comes to counterterrorism and when it comes to past conflicts in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And it may be no surprise as well, John, that this attack took place right at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, just as White House officials were heading into a meeting with the President of the United States, with Pentagon officials as well, to discuss the situation with Iran. And now the question becomes, as Margaret pointed out, what, if anything, does the President do in response? This was a well-signposted response by Iran. It didn't necessarily catch anyone by surprise. Is the president going to decide, you know what, they had to do this in order to save face domestically in Iran, and we're going to let it go? Or does the president seek to escalate? That's certainly something that Democrats on Capitol Hill have been very worried about, is how far does this go, even though the White House says that it strikes over the weekend on Iranian nuclear sites. We're self-contained. We're not meant to lead to further action. Once you see military strikes like this back and forth, what comes next is always unpredictable.
Indeed it is. Nancy Cordes, thank you. Let's bring back in Holly Williams, who's in Erbil, Iraq. Holly, I don't know if you heard Margaret Brennan was saying that one of the most vulnerable possible areas for an Iranian strike would be in Iraq. You mentioned earlier that Al-Assad Air Base is on the highest alert.
Right, so Margaret talked about the vulnerability of U.S. forces here in Iraq and in neighboring Syria. We are just a few miles from a U.S. base here in Erbil in northern Iraq, and I've spent time on some of those small U.S. Military outposts in Syria. I thought Margaret's reporting suggesting that this was a calibrated response is just fascinating, perhaps suggesting that this is almost, I guess, a face-saving operation, for want of a better word, on the part of the Iranians, that they need to not look weak in front of their regional rivals and their own people. But I would say this, back in 2020, Iran targeted the Al-Assad base here in Iraq with ballistic missiles. That followed the U.S. Killing a top Iranian military commander. We were on that base, on Al-Assad base, just a few days later, and we saw the extensive damage that had been done. Now, no American service members were killed, but some people would argue that that was good luck.
Mm-hmm. Holly, I want to just hold on to that. We're talking about calibrated response. There is a theatricality a little bit here, but just to underscore your point, which is that it may have been calibrated, but calibrated missiles explode just like ones that are sent with other intent.
There's always the risk of miscalculation and human error. I think the bigger picture here is we don't know how this is going to play out. If it indeed was a calibrated, as you say, almost a theatrical response, then do we also see diplomatic wheels turning? Do we see Iran capitulating, or at least agreeing to curtail its nuclear program? Or does this potentially spiral out of control into a bigger regional war?
Exactly. Holly Williams, thank you. Let's bring back in CBS News national security contributor Samantha Vinograd. Sam, tell us what steps have been taken here at home, and would this change anything in terms of readiness and preparations here if Iran somehow wanted to try to respond in the United States?
Sure, John. I will also note, just closing out the overseas element, that I do have sources indicating that the White House is anticipating additional strikes on U.S. bases overseas. And as I mentioned previously, the U.S. government has taken significant precautions to protect our members of the military to the greatest extent possible. Here in the U.S., security officials at the federal level have done outreach calls with their partners at the state and local level, with governors, with major law enforcement and religious associations, in anticipation of Iranian retaliation here at home. That could be individuals directed by Iran to launch attacks, part of their global proxy network. They spend decades cultivating a surrogate network here in the United States, what we call sleeper cells in layman's terms, or individuals inspired by what's happened overseas to act, individuals we call homegrown violent extremists. Potential targets likely will be people and places associated with the U.S. military, people and places associated with the U.S. government, members of the Jewish community, and people in places associated with the state of Israel. Now, intelligence gathering is at a very high level at this time to look for threats, and law enforcement has already significantly stepped up its operational footprint, the number of law enforcement assets it has in and around potential targets. So Homeland Security officials are preparing for this, but still quite concerned about the threat environment. And finally, John, the risk of Iranian-backed cyber attacks is very concerning. They have sophisticated cyber capabilities and have used them before against critical infrastructure. Think energy and water grids, transportation infrastructure, and more. So cybersecurity officials, members of the private sector, members of the public should all remain vigilant, monitor for threats, and stay in close touch with federal, state, and local law enforcement.
I made a wish for a moment.
I wish there would be peace. So guys, that's about CBS News today, guys.
Bahrain says it has shut down the airspace temporarily. This is amid fears of retaliation by Iran against retaliation in response to the U.S. attacks. We're going to go now to Charlie D'Agata, who is at the Pentagon. Charlie, there's a report out of the United Arab Emirates that Iran says that the missile barrage on Qatar was the same number of bombs used by the U.S. on the nuclear sites. How do they read that over there? What's your what's your sense of what that might mean?
Well, certainly the Qataris aren't counting that number. You know, Margaret had reported 6. We're hearing as many as 10, but nowhere near the amount of munitions that were dropped on those nuclear sites in Iran. And it's part of Iran's messaging here. And again, we discussed it before. This is symbolic. Going after Al Udeid, the biggest, you know, the headquarters of CENTCOM in the Middle East. It's symbolic, saying we're going to get you where you are. Also, one of the best defended, knowing full well that if any base was going to be able to defend against a missile attack, a short-range missile attack like that, it would be capable of doing that. And as we've discussed before, all of these bases throughout the Middle East have already been, you know, on high alert and reinforced with beefed-up surveillance. This is ahead of the attacks in Iran. And you mentioned Bahrain. The reason Bahrain has closed down its airspace, well, that is another huge base. That's the Fifth Fleet. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is based there. Kuwait has also rang the alarm in its areas. Again, these are all areas where there are U.S. bases, so not necessarily saying that they are next or that there's anything to indicate that they might be coming out under attack, but they're looking at what's happening at the audacity of attack at a place like Al Udeid and saying, well, we've got U.S. troops here, we've got U.S. troops in Bahrain with the Fifth Fleet, and then again, we really have to keep an eye on the more vulnerable troops, as Holly mentioned earlier, the ones who had already come under attack previously, places like Al-Assad, which is much more vulnerable to attack because they simply do not have the kind of air defenses that you might see at a place like Al Udeid and in Bahrain with the Fifth Fleet. Right. So I think we have to look at the nature of this attack, whether this is the beginning. The Qataris are saying that all of the missiles were intercepted without anybody getting injured. We're still waiting to hear from CENTCOM to see their reaction to it. But remember, CENTCOM is not just worried about Al Udeid. They're worried about every single base in that region. So they're going to have their hands full, and I understand why they're probably a little bit busy at the moment.
Charlie D'Agata, what we were seeing there before the map was the activation of the air defenses in Qatar. Let's go back to Margaret Brennan, who has some new reporting for us on the phone. Margaret?
Hi, John. We know that the other allies who have significant U.S. military presence on their shores, Kuwait, for example, which has the 4th largest U.S. military installation in the world, is bracing. There was an expectation that this firing at Qatar would happen, and that along with it there could be follow-on attacks. And so that is why some of the countries did start to look at closing their airspace earlier today. We know that there are further conversations being had as well amongst other U.S. intel agencies, Homeland Security officials, as well as the State Department and DoD CENTCOM about planning for this. So we do know that the Omanis, the Qataris, the Bahrainis, all of those countries that have been allies to both are bracing. What is interesting in terms of the firing at the U.S. base rather than at the city of Doha, for example, in Qatar, is that it's hitting at the United States directly. So far, these intercepted missiles did not appear to be aimed at domestic targets within Qatar. That would truly change the dynamic in the region. Qatar trades with Iran. Iran is not incredibly isolated in this region. It actually has started to rebuild some of its ties with some of these Arab states that they had tension with over years past. And so this is reintroducing some tension, though. But there's tension on the American side as well, with these allies saying, you know, we didn't have a warning well in advance that the United States was going to go ahead with this attack. The U.S. did notify 20 or 30 countries, a small number of them, though, when the planes were in the air. Those were who are in most direct risk. Saudi Arabia, for example, did have advance notice. Bahrain, some of the other regional allies did not.
And Margaret, very quickly, if the White House was expecting this, if this was the expected response, does that, going back to the idea of calibration, does that mean then that the next thing we should, how should that inform how we understand the next things we might hear from the Secretary of State or maybe even from the President himself, if this is something that was prepared for and if they receive it as a calibrated attack rather than a full-throated, all-out response?
Well, John, we know that in the planning for the attacks the U.S. carried out on Fordow, on Isfahan, and Natanz, it was not just the strikes that CENTCOM was planning for, it was also the blowback and preparing the theater. So there were protective measures put in place. So this had to have been gamed out with President Trump, right? He had to have been thinking about this as well. But that question is whether he goes up the escalation ladder or lets this go. And that is the difference between this being what was described yesterday in public by the Secretary of Defense as targeted and limited and specific to the nuclear program, or whether this becomes a more, a broader conflict. We know the President and the Secretary of State have indicated the U.S. has already identified other targets inside Iran it could hit. Didn't define that. Are those further nuclear sites, or are they now going to go up their escalation ladder?
Right.
So we know we've been looking at two options on it. It's going to be what he chooses.
Margaret Brennan, thank you very much. I want to go back to Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes, who has some new information. Nancy?
John, here's what we've heard from White House officials so far as they continue to watch what is unfolding in Qatar. We're told by a White House official that White House and DoD officials are aware of and closely monitoring threats to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Remember that top national security officials, Pentagon officials were already gathered at the White House for a scheduled meeting with the president. While there, they can take advantage of the Situation Room to monitor events as they unfold in Qatar. We have received more expansive reaction from the nation of Qatar itself, however. A short time ago, a spokesperson for the Qatari Foreign Ministry strongly condemning this attack by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, saying, quote, "We consider this a flagrant violation of the sovereignty of the state of Qatar." All of this putting the Gulf states and U.S. allies in the region in a very difficult position, John. On one hand, they don't want to get dragged into a wider conflict. On the other hand, they have had grave concerns about Iranian aggression and Iran's attempts to build a nuclear weapon for years, if not decades. And they shared those concerns with President Trump when he was in the region last month in Qatar, in the UAE, and in Saudi Arabia. As one top official in one of those Gulf states described it to me, they worry greatly about the possibility of a nuclear accident in Iran causing grave harm to their citizens. They said, look, if there was a nuclear accident in New York, you are going to feel the effects in New Jersey, and that's how they feel about it there. So a very difficult set of circumstances for Gulf states, who the president views as very close allies right now in the wake of these attacks.
Nancy Cordes with reporting from the White House. Thank you very much, Nancy. I want to bring back in retired Air Force Lieutenant General Mark Wetherington. General, give me a sense of, there are planes in the air, U.S. planes in the air. Give us a sense of what you imagine is going on in terms of a response or a possible response. Margaret Brennan talked about that ladder of escalation. Do you have an idea of what that ladder could range from?
Well, I think, John, the first thought that comes to my mind is that 6 to 10 short-range ballistic missiles is not insignificant, but it's not the kind of coordinated multi-axis attack that's going to saturate our air defenses. I think it's whether it's symbolic or whether it's a reflection of the capacity that the Iranian military has after Israel's actions over the last week. We'll learn that over time, but I think right now we'll sit and watch. We certainly have all the intelligence assets we can. We have all the force protection assets that we need if there were a different type of response from Iran, and I think we'll watch that situation develop.
What questions are going through your mind as somebody who's been in the jobs you have been, in terms of what would you want to know right now if you had access to the intelligence, or what do you think is the most important thing to think about over the next, say, 24 hours?
Well, there's a lot of questions. This could go a lot of ways, John. I think first and foremost, let's stick with the force protection problem, right? Is understanding the capacity that the Iranians have, understanding what they might be moving or positioning to take advantage of vulnerabilities that we have. I think we want to understand how well they can see and understand the battle space. And certainly our forces are taking actions, whether that's moving so that they're not always sitting stationary at an expected location and can be targeted. Right? We're going to take those appropriate actions to ensure American men and women and our allies are safe.
And linger on that last point again. What kinds of things, at the base right now, what do you expect is happening in terms of personnel?
Certainly they're strengthening their defenses. They're alerting people to be ready for an attack. They've got their equipment and personal protective gear with them. They understand where they're going to be able to shelter and those types of things. Air defense units on the installations are at a higher level of readiness and alert to respond if there is another missile attack of any type. And I think those significant assets, very vulnerable assets that we might have, we're looking to make sure, can we move them somewhere else, either out of harm's way or keep them moving so that they can't be targeted in a more static way.
One other thing I want to ask you about is something you mentioned is it the case, or do you imagine it's the case, that U.S. intelligence is trying to figure out not just what Iran will do, but what it can do now that it's been significantly damaged by the Israeli attacks and now by the U.S. action?
Absolutely. And I think your second question is the more important one, right? We want to understand that capacity. We want to understand what is the range of options that they have. It's not about necessarily picking, this is exactly what we think they can do. It's about understanding what's that range of possibilities and preparing for that range.
Right. All right. Let's go back now to Holly Williams, who is in Erbil, Iraq. Holly, just staying on that question of what Iran actually can do. Iran has been significantly weakened over the last 2 weeks as a result of these attacks.
Yeah.
That's right, John. Margaret was just talking then about the US expecting and planning for blowback. I think a lot of people here in the Middle East over the last day and a half have been sort of gaming out, asking themselves, what exactly is a weakened Iran capable of? What kind of retaliation can it carry out? Because make no mistake, Iran has been significantly weakened by more than 10 days of war with Israel. We have seen video after video coming from the Israeli military of strikes on missile launch sites sights on Iranian drones. Now, it's really difficult to quantify, but I think we can assume that Iran's military is significantly less capable than it was 10 days ago. Not only that, also think about Iran's proxies here in the Middle East, the so-called axis of resistance. They have also been significantly weakened over the last 18 months or so. Hamas has been pummeled in Gaza. Hezbollah's leadership has been decimated by Israel in Lebanon. Here in Iraq, the Iran-backed militia groups responsible for the deaths of hundreds of US troops over the years have also been significantly weakened. And then the Houthis in Yemen have also been targeted with airstrikes. So we've been asking ourselves, what is a weakened Iran capable of? I guess today we have a little bit more clarity on that.
Important point, Holly, that it's not just the missiles they can fire, but also what they can activate or not activate in those proxy forces that they have throughout the Middle East. Holly Williams, thank you. Let's bring in senior national security correspondent.
Supreme leader is intent on getting into a prolonged conflict with not just Israel, but with the United States, or if, having suffered maximum pressure from the United States, from Israel, and from international sanctions, these latest military strikes over the past couple of weeks will in fact push him back to the negotiating table. I know, John, that there's a war of words right now, a lot of inflammatory rhetoric being thrown around, but having worked on the early days of the Obama-era nuclear deal, it is possible that there are private channels that are open between the U.S. government and Iran and the supreme leader to try to find an off-ramp and to bring folks to the negotiating table. So again, the intelligence community's assessment of the supreme leader's intentions here, not just the nuclear program, not just his location, but the supreme leader's intentions should be a critical part of any national security decision-making process that exists in this White House and that tees up a decision for the President of the United States.
Sam, I think that that makes good sense, and you know, one of the things that we're trying to assess, because it will set the conditions for the U.S. response, is this idea of calibration. At the moment, there is no reporting that there are any strikes outside of the Al Udeid base in Qatar. And that would, again, seem to be a calibrated, predictable response. The air defense systems appear to be working, and there have been no reports of casualties. So if this is a response that had to be taken, but that was very limited so as not to lead to more escalation, it would seem that it would be hard to imagine designing it you know, for anything other than to maybe de-escalate and return to the negotiating table. What do you think about my what is admittedly speculation there?
Well, I will focus instead on the fact that we really just don't know at this point whether this was an isolated incident. If it is, then this was certainly a calibrated response, and I agree with your analysis. We just don't know. It is too soon to tell. We are receiving some reports that White House officials do believe that additional attacks on U.S. bases are coming. What we don't know is if they'll attack well-defended bases or if they'll concurrently activate proxies and launch cyber attacks. What we do know is where they have activated folks in the past, again, military installations, government officials, Jewish religious sites, Israeli diplomatic facilities, and more. So while we try to speculate on whether this is calibrated, the key factors here are whether this was an isolated incident, and if it was not, whether adequate security precautions have been taken at potential target sites to prepare for security incidents. I do know that here in the homeland there's been extensive planning, and as Margaret so aptly noted, prior to President Trump authorizing the military strikes over the weekend, there was significant planning about scenarios that could unfold if Iran chose to retaliate overseas. I think the biggest vulnerability here is for American citizens traveling overseas in locations where we just don't have a lot of assets, where proxies could be activated. That's one risk that will continue to follow, John.
Okay, Sam Vinograd, thank you very much. Let's go back to Senior National Security Correspondent Charlie D'Agata from the Pentagon. Just to reset for our viewers who are joining us, we have been reporting on Iranian missile attacks on the U.S. airbase or the U.S. base, I should say, in Qatar, the Al Udeid base in Qatar. At the moment, that is the only place we have reports of action. No casualties reported, and apparently the missile defense systems have intercepted whatever missiles were sent there. Charlie, let's go to you. Your thoughts?
I made a wish for.
Wish for peace. Guys, so that's new details on Iran's missile. Iran and Israel war update today,
confirms
guys.
Iranian short and medium range missiles targeted the Al Udeid air base. No casualties reported at this time. This is obviously after the Qataris themselves had said that they had come under attack. That happened about 50 minutes ago when we first heard word about it. Just to give you, again, a broad picture there. It's Al Udeid is the largest base. It's where Central Command is based. It's the headquarters there. There are 9,000 U.S. forces. In addition to that base, the biggest base in the Middle East, for U.S. forces, Bahrain is the home of the Fifth Fleet. That has had sirens going off and shelter-in-place warnings for the residents there, although there haven't been any incoming. Kuwait is also on high alert, another big base there. There were reports that the Al-Assad base in Iraq had come under attack, but both the Iraqis and others have said those reports are erroneous. But everybody is on high alert throughout that whole Central Command area because of what they're seeing here, not necessarily because there is a threat that's headed in their direction.
Sure, only prudent. Charlie D'Agata at the Pentagon, thanking you. Joining us by phone is Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan. Margaret, the latest you've been hearing, and also just as you've been evaluating this strike and what your reporting tells you about how we should think about the diplomatic conditions here and how they've changed, is there an opportunity here for the diplomacy to rush in? And if so, what is that opportunity?
Well, John, I've been trying to get hold of U.S. officials to better understand, the thinking in the White House right now. The message has been ready for diplomacy at any time. I was told by Secretary Rubio just yesterday that Steve Witkoff, the president's personal envoy, is on a 12-hour standby to get on a plane to meet with Iranian officials at any time should they say it's a go. We don't have any sign that it is a go at this moment in time. But what we are seeing play out is very much within the realm of anticipated risk, anticipated threat. And in fact, when this kind of intelligence is picked up, either through satellite, through signals intelligence, whatever the source of it is, the U.S. government prepares internally. Legally, they're also required to notify the public that there is risk. The first notice we got of this, we saw via the State Department telling people in Qatar to shelter in place if you're American. A few hours earlier, they issued a warning worldwide to Americans everywhere that there is an increased level of risk to Americans. That they are legally compelled to do when they are telling their own U.S. officials to prepare for something. And it doesn't necessarily mean it has to do with specific threat intelligence, but that because of what the United States did, enter this war that Israel has been waging against Iran and Iran hitting it back, the United States is now a player, not just because we are the biggest provider of arms and weaponry and defenses to Israel, but because now it is our planes that have gone in there and done such a high-profile attack against the crown jewels of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the clerics that run that country who have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in this program that they claimed was not a weapon, despite credible evidence suggesting otherwise, that they went beyond the civilian intention of it that they said that it was for. They have now been decimated. And that the airspace over Iran, they don't own. They are in a place where anyone gaming this out said Iran has to do something, they can't do nothing. Now, does this get it out of the way and clear the deck for the diplomatic opportunity you're talking about? We have to wait and see. But certainly we don't know what that means at this point. Secretary Rubio just yesterday kept emphasizing again and again they want to talk this out and come to a settlement with Iran. But at the same time, talked about how horrifically, how horrific the regime running the country is. So offering a lifeline for that regime to stay in power, it seems also to be a point of debate within the administration, because hours after we were told by the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State that the U.S. was not seeking regime change, the president put out a social media post joking about it.
Right. Margaret Brand, that point about the worldwide threat that has gone out now, even though it's automatic, it does give us a sense of the landscape of the national security concern in the wake of this attack. I want to get back to that question of regime change in a second, but General, let me ask you here. Margaret was mentioning the initial attack. Describe for our viewers the precision of the U.S. attack, just the nature of it, and how we should understand that in terms of the range of U.S. military action that could have been taken.
You bet, John. I think it's important for the viewers to understand that there's no other weapon system combination like a B-2 and the MOP. Just in terms of how those two are paired, the extreme navigation accuracy of the B-2 coupled with the precision on the weapon. It's a big weapon. It's not affected by environmental conditions like others are. And it's just so highly tuned to be precise, as we saw multiple weapons going into the same hole in the ground. And so I think a very technologically advanced attack, and one that only the U.S. could carry out.
And in your assessment, in terms of the precision, based on what we know, carried off as designed?
From everything that I've seen, absolutely within the design, very precise.
And to the extent, and we don't know that this is the case, but to the extent that it was precise, in other words, going after just the nuclear sites and not a lot of collateral action, how would you help us understand that? Because it would seem to be that the Iranian response might be inspired by this. In other words, if it was an indiscriminate U.S. response, that calls for a certain kind of response. If it's a targeted military response, that might call for another kind.
You're only going to call the B-2 and the MOP for a very specific target complex. Fordo was that complex. Very deep, very hard to target, had to be very precise. And so that's why it was used. I'm not sure I can compare it directly to the Iranian response. I think that's more of what's their capacity right now to respond, and whether that's a signal that they're sending in terms of what they'd like to see going forward, and if they want to continue to advance negotiations or something like that, I'm not sure.
Thank you, General. Let's go back to Holly Williams, who's in Erbil, Iraq. Holly, Margaret mentioned the question of regime change. Obviously, hangover from the Iraq War, in which that was the stated goal. The president's officials on Face the Nation and elsewhere were saying, we're not interested in regime change. Then the president suggests, maybe regime change wouldn't be so bad. How do you read all this, and how's it being read in the region?
Right, so John, I'm sure you saw that social media post from President Trump yesterday where he seemed to suggest that regime change in Iran was a possibility. We don't know how serious he was, and the White House sort of later said that, he was just raising it as a question. As you pointed out, engineered regime change here in Iraq and also in Afghanistan dragged the U.S., at least arguably, into a quagmire and cost the United States copious amounts of blood and treasure. Here in Iraq, we've been talking actually to Iranian opposition groups. Several of them are operating here. They're outlawed by the Iranian regime. They're living in exile across the border here in Iraq. The Iranian regime, as you know, is deeply unpopular with many Iranians. Just cast your mind back to the Woman Life Freedom protests of 2022. Now, what those Iranian opposition groups had to say to us was extremely interesting. They said, look, nobody wants war. But on the other hand, strikes served the purpose of weakening the Iranian regime, which is what they want. But they were very clear. They said that they did not want engineered regime change in Iran. They said they wanted to rebuild their country themselves into a truly democratic, free, secular, and non-nuclear Iran.
Holly Williams for us from Erbil, Iraq. Thank you, Holly. Senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang joins us now with new reporting. Weijia?
Well, John, we just heard from a defense official who tells CBS News that the Al Udeid Air Base was attacked by short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles originating from Iran today, adding that at this time there are no reports of U.S. casualties. Of course, they are closely monitoring the situation, as is President Trump, who was already scheduled to have a meeting with members of his national security team here at the White House just as these strikes unfolded, John.
All right, Lisa Zhang at the White House for
Okay,
us.
guys,
Thank you.
thank you
To
for watching.
recap, Iran has just launched a
Thank you for
retaliatory
joining my
strike
live
on the
and
U.S. air
listening
base
to this
Al
world
Udeid
news today,
in
guys.
Qatar. No
Update.
casualties are reported at this
Later, I
time, but
will make
officials are
again live
anticipating additional attacks on more
of
U.S.
this,
bases in the short term. The Iranian
watch
attack
my
was
uploads
in
right
response to
now
the targeted strikes
for
President Trump
tomorrow's
ordered over the
work.
weekend, which
We're
struck
hoping
3
for
key
peace
Iranian
between
nuclear
these two
sites.
countries,
Our
guys,
coverage will
because many
continue
people
on
are
CBS
dying
News 24/7
and their
your local
future
news
is,
and tonight
oh
on
my
the
God, it's
CBS
so
Evening
sad.
News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm John
We all
Dickerson
need
in New
peace.
York.
That's for the special report today, guys. Thank you for watching.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on CBS News 24/7. I'm Meg Oliver. We continue to follow breaking news this afternoon from the Middle East. Iran has launched a strike in response to the U.S. attacks this weekend on Iran's nuclear facilities. U.S. officials have confirmed Iran launched a strike at the U.S. base in Qatar. You're seeing video from Doha, which is near the base. It's the largest U.S. base in the Middle East. So far, no casualties have been reported. CBS News Middle East reporter Courtney Keeley is on set with me. And Courtney, what else do we know about these strikes? Tell us what you're hearing.
Well, the Qatari Prime Minister's advisor said that they thwarted the attack. They shot them out of the sky. They did not land. There are no casualties. That's the first most important thing to know. I did speak with a American expat who lives in Doha. In Doha, they heard the explosions more like thuds. It's about 17 miles away. This is the CENTCOM Forward headquarters. This is a big base and has a huge history of being in Qatar. It's been there for a long time. And so people remember General Tommy Franks there before the U.S. invasion of Baghdad. It is significant. That was a staging area for the fighter jets. But according to expats living in Doha, they are not sheltering in place. They are just being careful. So no seeming imminent threat right in Qatar, but that airspace is closed. Bahrain's airspace is closed. The UAE's airspace is closed. This is people are on tender hooks.
A big question, I think everybody, as they're watching this unfold, what is the risk to Americans overseas and back here on U.S. soil?
Well, there's never been a Shia terrorist attack in the U.S. There have never been sleeper cells, although we have been warned about them. It's usually been regional and often against Israelis. Like in Bulgaria, there's a history. In Argentina, there's a history. There's no history like an Al-Qaeda Sunni-led terrorist attack in the States. Hezbollah has mainly been decapitated, essentially. Hamas is on the back foot. But, of course, everybody has to batten down the hatches. The biggest escalation, the biggest fear, and this was from an Israeli top intelligence official, former official, retired now, who worked on the Iran portfolio, is God forbid a U.S. soldier is killed, because does this draw the U.S. in further? Will we have to retaliate? Will the U.S. have to retaliate if service members are hurt overseas, like in Qatar?
That's a very important point. I want to bring in Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan, who is on the phone with us. Margaret, do we know if or how Iran will retaliate against the U.S.?
Well, we know through intelligence sourcing and through the military radar in the area that this is coming. Can you hear me?
No.
I'm here.
Is Margaret Brennan on the phone?
Meg, are you able to hear me?
All right. When we get her, I can't hear her. Yeah, we'll just continue on and we'll come back to Margaret. Tell us, why don't you go ahead and try to tell me who you else are talking to?
Well, I think it's really important also to remember the history of U.S. involvement in places like Lebanon and Iraq, which did get to the point where there were terrible issues in the 80s, the Marine barracks bombings and the U.S. bombings. The U.S. had chosen a side in the Civil War, and it was the Iranians and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard that were in Lebanon at the time. So that's always been a sensitive area. In Baghdad, the Iranians really gained power after the U.S. invaded, and then there was a civil war, and now it's a Shia-led government with a Shia majority who are enjoying being back in power, not being oppressed. Bahrain is a sticking point that many people have talked to me, and former U.S. officials that were involved in Baghdad and Iraq in the National Security Council. And they said the reason Bahrain is a soft target is because it's an oppressed Shia minority. Now, it's really a proxy, essentially, of Saudi Arabia. So if Iran hits Bahrain, it's kind of hitting Saudi Arabia, but it's also making a point that about the Shia oppressed. You can't underestimate with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and with the Ayatollah the kind of deep-seated fundamentalism stance they're coming from. They're coming from generations and centuries that we could never nearly go back to in the U.S. They want the 12th Imam to come back. They believe in martyrdom for the cause, shaheeds, not necessarily on U.S. targets, but this is a real, you hit us, we'll hit you back.
What's the meaning?
We'll menace you in Qatar. We'll get everybody on alert. This is a psychological game, too.
A psychological game, but then also there are questions, if this conflict continues to escalate, how could it spread in the Persian Gulf?
Right, and there's always mission creep. Like, what happens if they start hitting more U.S. military bases? What happens if the oil facilities are hit in Saudi Arabia or the Strait of Hormuz is blocked? Then it becomes a global geopolitical issue. Right now, it's really Israel and the U.S., but really notable today and significant that we have to keep watching is the Iranian foreign minister was key to those talks with the U.S. and Iran that didn't continue after Israel started striking Iran. He's in Russia today.
What you mean,
and if you remember back from Syria, Iran sided with Russia in the Ukraine-Russia war. Russia sided with al-Assad and kept him in power and bombed Syrian civilians while they had to live in tunnels underground. Russia has a big stake in this region and always has since the Cold War. So for an Iranian foreign minister, there are three things they could be talking about. Back me up on the UN Security Council, use your veto power when you get it, and support us. We supported you in Ukraine. We need more arms and missiles. We've been depleted. That kind of thing is what we want. If Russia enters this and sides with Iran, that is a big game changer too. So we're really at the problem remains, what's next?
All right, and Courtney, we want to bring in CBS News Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan, who is on the phone with us right now. Margaret, I know you're talking with your diplomatic sources. What are you hearing?
Well, at this moment, it appears that attack by Iran on Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar has been concluded, though we haven't yet heard that there won't be further attacks later. It seems like for this moment, no reported death or injuries from the U.S. military. Sometimes, though, that takes time to actually assess. But what we know is that the United States and Qatar were able to be in communication well in advance of the attack actually being launched to prepare for what was about to come via the short and medium range ballistic missiles short and medium range missiles that the Pentagon announced were fired at what is the forward headquarters for all of the Middle East Central Command operations based there in that small emirate of Qatar. So this is very much Iran hitting directly at the command that helped to execute the attack on their 3 nuclear sites that the United States carried out overnight Saturday into Sunday. Now, this was calibrated. This at this point looks limited, but the United States is very much on alert for further potential risk to Americans. They have been warning Americans traveling abroad, in particular in the region, to exercise an abundance of caution. there are certain things you can protect and anticipate, and that would be the category of attack we just saw in terms of incoming missiles. There are the other lower level attacks that are harder to prevent against. And so that is why Americans are being warned to exercise caution, be aware of their surroundings, because America has entered this war that Israel launched on Iran just a few days ago.
Thank you. We want to bring in CBS News senior foreign correspondent Holly Williams, who is in Iraq. Holly, what are you hearing?
I made a wish
I wish for
a
peace.
moment.
Okay, that's it for today, guys. I want to review what Cut Robertson. Speak really low. Yeah, did I? Or maybe because of the news I'm listening is it's very high, the volume. That's why you don't understand when I'm talking. That's it for today, guys. So thank you for joining. Thank you, Raymond Gilkes, for coming to my live, and we are listening to the news between the war of Iran and Iraq. Oh, who is this? Okay. I want to block this. Why? How to block this? I want to block this man. Why? Why talking nonsense to my live? I want to know who you are. I have to check it out who you are. Why you're talking nonsense to my live? How can I hide you? And I want to check who you are and why you're talking to me like this. Okay? I want to check it out. Wow. How can I check it out? Oh my gosh. Okay. Thank you guys. I will check this comments, this nonsense comments. This one person messaged me nonsense to my serious live about the news and update to this war. Okay, thank you guys for everything. Bye.